The internet is a big, amazing, and complicated space where people build community, can create anything they can imagine, and make connections all around the world. I'm John Starr, advisor at Thorn, and this is Safe Space, a podcast about the people working behind the scenes to protect millions of users every day. These are the leaders of trust and safety, their stories, their journeys, and what fuels their mission to build a safer internet for all of us. Hey everyone, I am super excited for today's conversation. We have Aaron Rodericks, who is the head of trust and safety at Bluesky, with us today. He was on the trust and safety team at Twitter, working site integrity matters. And even before that, he worked in public service at the Canadian government. Aaron, welcome to Safe Space. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me, John. It's great to see your face again.
Just a reminder for our listeners, there's a lot of conversations about trust and safety, and this podcast is about conversations with people who do the work to bring humanity to our field. Aaron, as you can see, we've traded in the TrustCon studio for a home studio, and excited to jump right in. So one of the conversations that perhaps in hindsight is really obvious in kind of talking to pros like yourself over the past couple of years is this kind of like tie-in into where they are now in trust and safety, kind of into what they wanted to be when they were a young person. And when we were speaking kind of earlier, I'm curious, like, is this the same for you? Like, what were your ambitions as a young person, and kind of how are they tied to the work that you do now?
See, the good thing is that I answered you based on my memory because, when you ask your parents, they tell you the horrifyingly stupid things you actually wanted to do. But my memory, at least, goes back to my dad used to buy these stacks of National Geographic magazines, and I would pore over them for hours and be transported to these amazing places, environments, animals, exotic. Just it always blew my mind, and I wanted to do that passionately. I really, really wanted to be that photographer who traveled all over the world and captured and learned from these places. Turns out by the time I was even close to being an adult, National Geographic had dropped all of those photographers and only hired local stringers. So then the next ambition was to become a war photographer, which, as you can imagine, my parents loved that idea a great deal. So I became the next best thing, which is a wedding photographer, which it turns out can still be a fantastic source of PTSD.
So you said something. So you recently had a LinkedIn post in which you kind of noted that a number of folks have reached out to you about your career path in trust and safety. I'm just reading the post here, and you commented on, I'm not sure my journey can be helpful to most. I find your journey fascinating. I'm curious, with that lens in mind, I'm curious, take us through a little bit. Let's go through your path to where you are now. And perhaps we can start with this concept of photography. Knowing that you joined the government in a public service capacity, walk us through a little bit of some of that journey along the way. What were some moments that really helped guide you and helped you really prioritize where you wanted to be or what you wanted to do? And also, I would love to kind of unpack a little bit the framing of, I'm not sure my journey will be helpful for most.
I think far too many people are looking for a roadmap for their own career. If I get the following check boxes done, I can be in your role. And you know what? I wish them all the luck with that. But the reality is that trust and safety was in a massive expansion period. I was hiring these amazingly talented specialists 3-4 years in, that made me feel as if I was the least qualified person on the team. I frequently felt that I shouldn't be hired on my own team at the things we did, nation state investigations or things of that nature. And I find as trust and safety gets more developed, gets more concrete curriculum, gets more details in the weeds, that it becomes harder and harder for someone who's, shall we say, an extreme generalist like myself, to go and say, oh no, follow my career path, because trust and safety didn't exist when we got into it. A lot of these I mean, I'm not that old, but shall we see a lot of the definition, a lot of the terms, product
Totally.
trust, things like that, those weren't in play. As I've seen there become a lot more of that granularity, that's what I mean, that trying to echo my path won't serve you in the same way it did me.
It's so very true that a lot of the roles that are in place now at major tech companies, smaller tech companies, they didn't exist when we were young people. So going back to your journey, what drove you to the government? What was the driving force there?
Honestly, the reality of how I got into government was an accident, kind of like Twitter. I worked for a media analysis firm. I decided to take a long vacation, and they didn't have long vacation policies, so I lost my job. That's fine. My family wanted to take a really long family trip, and that was great. I valued that at the time, and I'm really glad I made that decision. A couple of my coworkers had gotten to government and said, "Hey, do you want to basically double your salary to go into government?" And when you're in your early 20s, that seems like a great idea. So got into government. I was initially doing media analysis, quickly got into web and comms, enjoyed it. It was appealing. One of the driving forces for me, and it's consistent throughout, is this need to have an impact.
Mm.
And that's what really drove all my roles, even now at Bluesky and in government. It was trying to find the place that you could have the most impact. And it turns out in government, you got plenty of problems that they need to solve. And the system is only good at solving some of them. In those cases, I quickly found things like Afghanistan to work on that needed, huge problems to be solved. From there, I went away to school for a bit, came back, and was really intrigued at the time by social media. From that 1.0 web, all of a sudden we had this huge leveler. We had disruption going around. And at the time we were like, hey, this could be used for democracy and making everyone, the world a more equal place. We were very naive and optimistic back in that day, but we were seeing things like Tahrir Square and looking at all the possibilities. So initially I got into social media doing the very basic social media management kind of stuff, taking government accounts, making them significantly more popular, et cetera. Just very boomer, I guess, things as they would be phrased. I mean, I cannot post for Bluesky. I am definitely not cool enough. But for government, 10 years ago, I was good enough.
You were
Uh,
pretty cool then.
Cooler than the average, let's
Yeah.
just say. From there, I then realized there were all these cool problems that you could solve. And the one that Canada was struggling the most with was we were in all these places. Take Iran, take Syria, take Ukraine, and diplomats normally go and talk to their government counterparts. When you have the Euromaidan in Ukraine, when you have the Syrian revolution, when you have a disagreement with the Iranian government, all that falls apart. And you're no longer able to operate in that country in the same way you were able to do before. So I managed to take that kind of social media knowledge and then transform it into this new initiative called direct diplomacy, which at the time was very advanced for Canada. And it was about thinking about how to use the internet to, instead of going government talks to government, going down a level and going, how can we understand what's going on in the country? What's important to those people? How can we set up digital embassies and then connect with those people? That experience of just understanding the internet, understanding on a geopolitical scale, then applying it to a range of problems, whether it's terrorism or geopolitics, et cetera, really helped pave the way for me to eventually get into Twitter and start doing this, within the tech space.
Super interesting. Super interesting. As someone who also came from the public sector, I can really resonate with the concept of how can I have the most impact? And I think that's also been a theme as we speak with pros like yourself on finding that they can have as much or more impact working in our field, especially at some of these global platforms. And we'll get to Bluesky here in a moment. One of the things that you mentioned, you kind of put on the horizon of your last comment joining Twitter. What then was the drive for you to, or the why for you to get into trust and safety? And is that why the same why that keeps you here?
Yeah, pretty much. It's funny when you look at your life as a broader parachute. There's the book, What is My Parachute? But when you look at your life as a broader narrative, it's easy to back out and find the connecting dots. And it's that trying to achieve the difference, trying to have impact at scale that connects all the work I did throughout. Even being a wedding photographer, oddly enough, you got to viscerally feel that impact of capturing people's lives on a day-to-day basis, capturing the most joyous occasions and giving them moments they could treasure for years to come. That was of huge value. You can have it on a small scale and you can have it at a global scale, but it's what sits with you at the end of the day is what matters.
Makes a lot of sense. So, is there a moment that really helped, like, solidify for you that you were in the role that you're in, or help maybe shaped your career to help get to where you are now?
Two examples, I guess, come to mind. The first is I had a colleague at Twitter, Jordan. A phrase that I remember is, "We don't suspend family members of bad accounts." And the second was a quote from Yoel, who wrote in a strategy for the team. And he said, "Our priorities are the safety of our users, the platform, and Twitter, the company, in that order." And both those were incredibly meaningful for me because the first meant that we were always at least aiming for the perfect decision. Even if someone in a household was doing incredibly bad activity, that didn't mean that their family members had to pay the price. Even though they were using the same infrastructure, sometimes the same phones and computers, we were still trying to get it right and be fair to the bad actor versus their innocent family members. And then from Yoel's perspective, or Yoel's quote, it really stuck with me till today because I always wished I had that level of mission orientation in government.
Right.
But instead, everyone's so focused on their own turf. I wish someone said, what we care about above and beyond all things was the outcome to Canadian citizens. I wish we had that. Yeah, I'm clearly way too much of an idealist. At Twitter, I got some aspects of that. I still got to hear that we cared about the users above and beyond when we were making all of our decisions, and I could align my values and my priorities that way. And that's why those two have stuck with me and fed the warm parts of my soul in that we were still trying to do the right thing on a day-to-day basis.
Love that. We all have them. What is an "oh, no" experience that, you've had, of course, that you can talk about?
Those were so constant. Thankfully, you're always learning. Unfortunately, it's frequently
Right.
by making mistakes. I was doing an investigation. I think I suspended maybe 300 accounts, but I permanently suspended them at Twitter. Later on, I found out I'd made an error and we needed to reverse that decision. That's fine. You make mistakes as long as you can reverse them and say you're sorry and apologize for them. You can improve the next time. Turns out Twitter's tooling didn't allow you to reverse permanent suspensions. So I had to go through them all one by one and reverse them. Thankfully, eventually our tools fixed that. A similar mistake I made a couple of years later, in that I was investigating a suspicious network in India. I asked all these accounts, it was thousands of them, to just reconfirm the information. But the way Twitter's tools worked is when you asked them to reconfirm the information, they were dropped from people's follower numbers. And it turns out in India, people really, really, really care about their follower numbers. Phones started going off the hook and people are like, why are my follower numbers dropping? I mean, just, ballistic. That was a decision I worked my way back on. And all these errors were frequently caused by me looking at the pile of work and trying to do things fast as opposed to making the right decision. And so I continually remind myself it's more important to work on the right things than to do as many things as possible because you'll never have enough time.
A safer internet doesn't happen by accident. It takes dedicated people and purpose-built solutions. That's where Safer comes in. Built by child safety technology experts using predictive AI and proprietary hash matching, Safer helps detect child sexual abuse material and exploitation at scale. Platforms like Bluesky, Stability.ai, and Vimeo rely on Safer to proactively detect online sexual harms against children. Want to learn how you can put Safer to work on your platform? Visit safer.io. Really an interesting phenomena in trust and safety is a lot of the quote unquote errors happen to be tooling related. They happen to be a random spam bot. They happen to mean someone with good intention is moving really quickly, and they're often not reflected as such externally. My next question for you was actually, do you have a trust and safety pet peeve? And for me, your kind of answer to your last question is essentially a pet peeve of mine, is when there is this major misalignment of reality of what actually happened. You're speaking to someone right now whose team suspended every new user sign up on Twitter for 8 hours, kind of at one point before they figured out. But the reality is that we were in the very early days of trying to understand and eliminate foreign terrorist organizations from our platform. And so we have to work very quickly. We had to work in kind of new ways. And when you do that, you make mistakes. But those mistakes were tied to a tooling capacity, not necessarily poor intention. Do you have a trust and safety pet peeve? Is there a pet peeve out there for you that really resonates?
I guess going off your point, it's people love to create their own narratives. And in fact, it's far too easy in many cases to create a narrative of persecution in the absence of the other side being able to speak. In each and every case, I'm not going to get in there and say, well, this is actually what happened. How many death threats did you actually make before we suspended you? But but the user instead will go, it was because of my beliefs. It was because of my views. It was because of this. It was because I was mass reported. My God, the amount of times I hear that. The reality is usually completely diametrically opposite, but they go out with that narrative constantly. And I don't know if there's a good way to combat that.
So back to your LinkedIn post. You commented on trust and safety being in a contraction phase. Tell me more about your thought there. Obviously it was tied to folks looking at your career path and seeing like, if I could check these boxes, I could get there. And I'm curious to learn, is there more to that? Is it different to trust and safety in a contraction phase versus what it was like maybe when we got into the space, that it was maybe on the other side of the continuum?
Absolutely. You could pull trust and safety out of it entirely. This can apply to any industry, which is kind of what I was trying to convey, in that when you're in a massive expansion phase, every single company is growing. You can get a little bit of experienced people by stealing them from your competitors, let's just say, but that's only going to get you so far. You can do a little bit of poaching, but at the end of the day, you're going out for talented, intelligent people who can come in and have transferable skills to solve problems. In fact, for lower agents, as long like lower roles, as long as you're a warm body with a willingness to learn and you're eager, that might be enough. The challenge is now, after years of expansion, nearly all the major companies in which the majority of roles are reducing. If you're trying to get into that space, there's a glut of amazingly talented people who have now, spent years in these skill sets, growing policy experience, growing data analysis capabilities. They have all that, and they're fighting for a reduced set of roles to try and just stay employed in a field that they love, in a field that they mean they can have a difference. Meanwhile, you're trying to get in there at the bottom. You still can, and that's the point that I was making, but It's so much harder.
One of your pieces of advice that I think is a really interesting one is the regulatory shifts are creating by requirement certain levels of roles or expertise at providers, and that could be another really, I think, interesting entry point like along the way. Shifting gears a little bit to Bluesky, my reference point for scale and growth, at least being an insider, is Twitter circa like 2014 to 2020. Twitter was an already established platform. It was post IPO I joined, and yet the scale and growth was unlike anything I've ever felt, especially coming from the government, as I'm sure you can relate to that. Bluesky has experienced 0 to 90 growth. I want to spend some time talking about how you do your job in that environment. What is that like for you as a human? I'm sure you have a lot of free time, Aaron. I'm sure you have a massive team, by the way. Let's start to chip away at like some of the realities of maybe what it's like to trust in safety at a very small company and how to navigate challenges that are perhaps obvious, but that you have to really address in real time.
I think the first starting point is many people don't know the company size. Bluesky's still pre-revenue. I think that's a more polite way of saying we still haven't figured out what our business model is. And that's fine. We want to do it right. And that takes time and effort. And we're focused more on growth at this point. That's totally fair. But as a result, it places constraints on me having this massive trust and safety team because we don't have the advertising model that brings in tons and tons of money. So instead, the entire company is how many people? 20. We are 20 people. The vast majority are engineers working on building the systems, getting the app in a great place. And you know what? They're miracle workers. They're all unicorns. They do amazing work. I love them all. I am thankful and gifted to be working with such an amazing group of people. Summer 2024, we were growing at a incredible rate of something like 3,500 users a day. Fast forward to November, we were growing at 1 million users a day. A slight increase. And for someone in trust and safety, when you're looking in small amount of happiness and main amount of horror, going, what do? You basically take your previous roadmap, your strategy, and you throw it in the garbage because it's meaningless. And you go, okay, this is no longer a problem of how do you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time. This is you have a herd of elephants, you have a continent of elephants. How do you prioritize that? And it is that ruthless prioritization. Okay, how many tickets do we get in 2023? 370,000. How many tickets do we get on one day after the election? 250,000. So, on an order of magnitude, the incoming is orders of magnitude bigger than we're expecting. We're shifting languages. We're seeing how do we get additional surge capacity in there right away. Does that mean your quality drops significantly? Absolutely. But at that point, it is throw humans at the problem in order to stabilize the situation, because that at the moment was what I had to do. And you have to make those decisions over and over again to keep the lights on and keep the systems, from completely melting down across the board.
One of the massive gaps in the public conversation is the expectation gaps between what a person walking down the street who uses Bluesky every day, uses a platform every day, they must have exponentially more humans working at that service than they do. They're clearly going to look at every report that I send. And it's not a reality at the scale of growth that some platforms have. Ideally, they have it incrementally. And so you can get better at a pace that is similar to the growth. But when it happens, like it's happened for Bluesky in a really massive way, it's hard to play catch up. And the expectation gaps are ripe for frustration and the like. And so totally makes sense. I wish there was a conversation rooted in realities of kind of how that works and how we all kind of process it as humans and move forward. I'm curious, you referred to yourself as a generalist. That was super interesting to me because when we worked together, I saw you more as a specialist on a really core, important piece of work. However, in your role right now, I would imagine you have to be a generalist because of the work. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you see yourself as a generalist and the importance of being a generalist, maybe as the company scales at the pace that you do.
I think the benefits of being a generalist is it gives me a good excuse to be bad at almost everything. Back at Twitter, that was my space. That is what I did, memorize the shape and form of different actors. And, you could tell me, I could tell you, nope, this is aligned with a certain actor in a millisecond. I'd just be able to. So yes, for years, I was a specialist within certain spaces, particularly nation state actors, and I loved it to bits. But then I think the curse of management is that over time, I managed a larger and larger team of just amazingly talented and technical people that made me feel incompetent on a day-to-day basis. And it's because we just kept on getting over time more adversarial complexity. The things that bad guys were doing were 10 times, 50 times more complicated as what they were doing 5 years prior. And I was great at organizational memory in terms of, what they did that time and that time. But the skills and the technical capabilities to dig into that activity day in, day out, especially what the Russians were doing, got more and more complicated over time. Here, on the other hand, I have, 1% of my capacity for disinformation campaigns, 0.5 for GDPR complaints, maybe 5% for all the legal subpoenas, 3% for policy. So I'm just spread super thin across a wide range of things. So I think at this point, all I can call myself is still, back to that original thing of a hard problem solver, also flying by the seat of my pants as things evolve across this huge landscape and change on a day-to-day basis.
In your role currently, as a user of Bluesky myself, and also engaging with you and seeing you at conferences, seeing you on conversations like this, having conversations like this in a public way, you trust in safety in a very public way. You're a public person. This is I think a really kind of interesting kernel to kind of unpack a little bit. What is it like to do our job in a public way? And what sort of considerations come along with that?
This switch has probably been the hardest one for me in this latest role, because coming from government, your job is to be invisible. You make, your job is to give fearless advice to your political leaders, and then they execute it. It's called fearless advice, loyal execution. That's how it worked at government. And that's really what I brought into Twitter, and was basically largely invisible until the end, when I got much more of a public profile than I wanted. But coming into Bluesky, it just creates an enormous discrepancy in expectations. And I'm, of course, totally unused to it, because I'm extremely introverted and I like reading, and then all of a sudden, you have 34 million users, and, some of their views are perceiving trust and safety as a customer support function. So then you are the head of customer support for their feelings at times. Every time they see something they disagree with, they yell at me, which works from a version when you're at a major platform and there's only one size fits all set of rules. So when the gatekeepers, that advocacy model of influencing a platform to change the rules when you're dissatisfied with something, is kind of the mental model that people are trapped in. And unfortunately, they've brought those instincts and those habits to Bluesky, when the reality is we've given them so much user control, we've given them so much capability, but they're still looking for values-based judgments from Bluesky writ large, where I'm trying to install a rules-based system where when you violate these rules, consequences happen to you. But when you don't violate these rules, I am not going to make values-based decisions based on whether I can investigate all your activities off platform, et cetera. I think that the burden of expectations when you try to take all criticism as fair makes it impossible. The way that I've adjusted over the past year is that, in addition to, I guess, growing a bit of a thicker skin, I've learned to just differentiate. I've learned to value criticism from people with expertise. I've learned to look for the nugget from people who genuinely are discomforted by things they find, but to look at it in aggregate and go, well, what kind of signal does it mean for me to take that into consideration from a severity, from a prevalence perspective, and then do I need to change your policies and things moving forward, as opposed to people are yelling at me, therefore I'm failing, therefore everything is wrong. So separating myself from the role from what Bluesky can reasonably do.
I think one of the very directional thought around criticism is it's an indicator of a relevancy of the platform, and we certainly felt that when we were at Twitter. The burden of that from a human perspective. How do you take care of yourself? And any advice for folks who are kind of in these roles, are beginning to go in those roles? How can you create space in this role, which on a platform like Bluesky, certainly on Twitter, we had alerts on our phone when certain things happen. It's tied to the platform. Your life starts to get tied to work. And so what are some tips and practices that you've found have been helpful?
Oh, there's so much there, but I guess the first and most important lesson that I had to learn years ago, and I have to keep learning every day, is that you are not your job. And that's probably one of the hardest ones to viscerally understand, because these jobs are all consuming. When we're growing by 1 million users a day, you could start to get targeted by CSAM networks, et cetera. It's easy to just lose all perspective. There were days I was working 15, 16-hour days trying to help the backlog. But at the end of the day, you're one person. You're trying to deal with the biggest problems. One of the most valuable lessons is something as basic as you have to put on your own oxygen mask first. Aaron is also a human being. And
what?
I know. I know. But it's been really easy to forget that. It's been really easy to forget it as a startup when you're under-resourced, when you have all these people with needs, with feelings, with wants, and they want from you all day, every day. And there's always criticism. Why can't you do more? It's the message you continually hear day in, day out. And you know what? The thing I've had to remember is if you can't take care of yourself, there's nothing left. You're just totally drained for who needs to show up every day to bring their best self to work, to make Bluesky what it needs to be, that place of positive intent, the place that can be a home. What are the things we're trying to accomplish at Bluesky? We want people to enjoy social again. We want to reduce the torment nexus. Well, you don't do that by making yourself a torment nexus. Things I've had to learn along the way is that find Aaron again. And that first year was a bit of a rough learning curve, but who expected that? I certainly didn't. So I'm just trying to make time, pick up archery. Means I'm outside. I'm really focused on, does pointy thing go in target, do more meditation, do more yoga, just do things where I have to be in my body, in the present. And the more I'm in the present there, the more I can be present for the people around me, be hopefully a better husband, be a better father. And then, ask, what are the most important things you can focus on for the company? Because when I get that order reversed, which all too often I do, it's the infinite mountain of elephants, or whatever the analogy is, overwhelms everything else, and there's nothing left. And you're just you're a ball of negativity because you've given everything you can give, and you're in, I don't know what the term is, like caregivers overload, or et cetera, by trying to spread yourself too thin across too many places.
You're on empty. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
there's so many moments of when folks on our teams, at least I can remember a really good story at Twitter. Something happened. I think it was one of those mistakes that a tool made. I think a common trait with trust and safety practitioners is we are always hardest on ourselves and anyone else is going to be on us. And this person was being very hard on themselves because of the relevancy, because of the impact of it, because of that distortion in the public conversation around the intentions behind it, right? And I remember another colleague on our team came up to her and put her arm around her and said, remember, it's only a website. And for me, it was a really important kind of moment. It's not that we didn't care as much. It created a moment of perspective, of literal touch, of like being connected to another human and finding that perspective again. It created a bit of buoyancy to fill the cup, to get out of empty and to keep going. There's so many stories of when people who are sitting right next to you are the ones that are filling your cup and keeping you going because they're the ones that understand it the most. And so I love the frame of finding Aaron again. I want to talk about kind of nonprofit, roles in the space. Thorn obviously is a nonprofit. The nonprofit ecosystem plays a really important role. Civil society plays a really important role in trust and safety, content moderation, policy, discussions. What are some ways that the nonprofit space really adds a lot of value, and what are ways that you think could be opportunities for either civil society like Thorn or others to maybe help trust and safety teams like at Bluesky?
I've done a lot of work with civil society, and one area where I was deeply interested in at Twitter was trying to develop more equitable policies. The amount of impact of election misinformation can lead to on-the-ground violence, significantly more harms in global South environments than when they're applied in the global North. Civil society brings just an incredible wealth of on-the-ground expertise and knowledge. I think we've been trapped in this gatekeeper model where civil society holds all these problems, but they don't want to work for free. I deeply understand that. They're under-resourced. They're coming from global South environments, and they're trying to access the gatekeepers to influence these major platforms. It's just a dynamic that's created a huge amount of resentment. Even when you make these trust and safety policy groups, et cetera, safety councils, are they a box checking exercise, or are they genuinely taking their considerations in? And I find a lot of people are still stuck in that model when it comes to Bluesky, except they're trying to call me to do partnership, do work. I was on call with the UN, call with civil society a little bit earlier, and they're all going like, how can we partner? The amazing part about Bluesky's specific model is that we don't need to, because we're not holding the keys. The ecosystem is open. You can get in there, you can influence, you can start moderating, you can start your own labelers, you can even start your own app on the system if that's what you drive. Now, some of these things require technical investments, fully understand, but you no longer need to come through me as the sole blocker for your theory of change, which I think is extremely powerful, but we haven't necessarily jumped over that hurdle as yet. So everyone's still looking like, how can we access the tools of
Yes.
power? And I'm like, they are yours. How can I help you to use them? There's many things we can do, but
Mm.
hopefully this open ecosystem, this open model changes the relationship. And I guess on a second answer to the thorn part of it, I would love the more we start investing in changing the way the whole ecosystem works, as opposed to having these few power players with all the money and the resources, and everyone tries to access the gatekeepers. It's similar to the previous one. It's how can we spread that across the ecosystem. One thing that deeply saddened me is IFTAS.
Yep.
IFTAS was an organization paying for all of these orgs in the Fediverse to access CSAM resources, and they just couldn't get enough funding. And I wish I had a way to unlock that or change that model. And I don't have great answers, but hopefully in the future we'll get there and be able to unlock these resources for small players so that you don't need the blue sky trade-off of having centralized trust and safety to achieve safety at scale.
You've referenced a few points now of legacy tactics and mindset that have shown success or not in terms of influence or change with respect to a centralized internet. Whether that be through applying pressure or the literal tools on how we engage are designed for a centralized space, or even this kind of disconnect between wanting access or having the tools to create the change that I think some from civil society are are hoping to make. How is Blue Sky driving that change? I would love to hear more about how Blue Sky is going to ensure that this isn't something you have to go to Aaron to understand. How do we change the public conversation, but also the realities of access to really kind of apply a perspective, like apply for driving the change that folks from different kind of nonprofits want to seek, or maybe even people in the public? I feel like there's a gap between like knowing how to do that right now. So like how is Blue Sky going to be driving that, knowing that you play a really important role as maybe the largest platform that's taking on like a new model around this sort of like chipping away at centralization?
I think our model of composable moderation, it's under-resourced. It is a 1.0, maybe even a zero point 0.1. It changes that dynamic.
Yeah.
And instead of trust and safety having the expectation that it's going to be all things to all people, it says we're going to give you a baseline and
Mhm.
then you can do whatever you want with the rest. So one of the best examples at the moment is Black Sky. You have Rudy Frazier, and I don't want to praise our systems too much. He has created this despite, you know, the systems we put into place, but he's created Black Sky. Within Black Sky, you have different labels. The one that comes to mind is misogynoir. So when the Black community gets targeted by individuals or by content, they can apply those labels, and members of the Black community who subscribe to that can filter it out. As people have more organizations they trust or can lean on. For example, while I worked on disinfo campaigns, I just don't have the capacity, the tooling, etc., to go spending all my days hunting Russian bots. In this case, I have experts who are on Blue Sky who are doing this with our data because it's open. And you have Conspirator Norteño continually publishing articles on the bots. And I can go, oh, this makes me look bad. But you know what? What I feel is just gratitude because I have
Mm.
expertise. I have someone who's invested in making this place better. I have anti-bot Navalny just making lists of Russian bots. And I can just go, thank you so very much. You know, look at them with a bit of a check, but I get to clean
Sure.
it up based on the expertise of our users. It is about participatory moderation as opposed to gated. And I think that ecosystem of leaning on the expertise of communities, of organizations, et cetera, is how we will develop a new model together. And we don't have all the answers, but that's where we're going, as
Yeah.
opposed to saying that we have all the answers, which I assure you I do not.
It's a great transition into a final conversation point. So Say we're back together in 3 years. Give us a prediction about the space, maybe a trend or two that you think are really interesting.
I think the big one is AI. There's just no getting away from it. A lot of people are genuinely and fairly concerned about copyright, grabbing people's content, etc. But on the positive side, I have seen years of moderators. What's the best way to clean up CSAM? Unfortunately, you can clean it up using a lot of automated tools, but you still need to expose people to it all day, every day to make sure that those reports go into NECMEC, go into law enforcement, etc. The more that we can assist mods to make better decisions by giving them synthesis, by rolling up content, by putting these facts at their fingertips, you can make better decisions most of the time, consistent decisions, and you can remove the burden of the worst of the worst content from those moderators. You don't have to keep on re-exposing, re-triggering them. There's only so much giving them psychological support is going to do when they just have to stare at egregious content all day. The more that we can lift that burden off of them, I know that people want a curated human experience, but the reality is when you see the human cost on mods to be exposed to the content every day, I don't wish that on anyone.
Aaron, I knew today's conversation was going to be interesting, and you delivered. I really appreciate you joining us for the conversation, and I wish you nothing but the best. To all the trust and safety pros out there, keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate you. Until next time.
Appreciate you as always, John.
To our listeners, thanks for being part of the conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. If you want even more from today's guest, be sure to check out our lightning round Q&A session on YouTube.